The envelope had been sitting there since before dawn. Minerva McGonagall noticed it the moment she entered her office, not because it was placed prominently or because it bore any official seal, but because it was the only thing on her desk that had not been there the night before. Everything else was hers. The stack of unmarked third-year transfiguration essays, the timetable for the coming week annotated in green ink, the small tartan tin that held nothing more remarkable than shortbread. But the envelope was new, and in her experience, new things that arrived without announcement rarely carried good news. She set down her teaching robes on the back of her chair and did not approach the desk immediately. Instead, she crossed to the narrow window and looked out at the grounds. It was early October, and the sky above the forbidden forest was the particular shade of grey that promised neither rain nor sun. A non-committal sky, she had always thought, the kind that refused to commit to any feeling whatsoever. The Black Lake was flat and still. A single light burned in Hagrid's hut. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she turned and opened the envelope. It was from the ministry. Not an official communiqué. Those came on parchment with the seal pressed in violet wax and the cramped, officious handwriting of whatever junior clerk had been assigned to draft them. This was a personal letter written by hand from Aberforth Dumbledore's contact at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a witch named Hestia Pruitt, who had been passing word to Hogwarts staff when the news was too difficult to send through official channels. It was 4 sentences long. Katrina Fawley was killed on Tuesday evening in Ayrshire. She was 23. She fought back. I thought you would want to know before you read it in the Prophet. McGonagall read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original crease, placed it in the top left drawer of her desk, and sat down in her chair. Katrina Fawley, Gryffindor, class of 1975. She had been a careful student, not brilliant, not the sort who set the classroom alight with unexpected answers, but careful and persistent in the way that McGonagall had always privately considered more valuable than raw talent. She had struggled with switching spells in her 3rd year and had come to McGonagall's office 3 Tuesday evenings in a row without being asked until she had mastered them. She had left Hogwarts with 7 OWLs and a handshake, and McGonagall had thought, as she thought with most of them, that one will be all right. 23 years old. McGonagall placed both hands flat on the surface of her desk and looked at nothing in particular. This was the 4th since June. Peter Yaxley's son, not a Death Eater, just in the wrong place. In June. The Mackintosh twins from Hufflepuff, gone within a week of each other in August. And now, Katrina Fawley, who had sat in the 3rd row and written her essays in blue-black ink and struggled with switching spells until she no longer did. The stack of unmarked essays was still there. She could see the top one from where she sat. 3rd year Douglas Hathaway, who had written his name in letters large enough that she suspected he hoped to take up more space on the page and thereby obscure how little he had written. She could hear, distantly, the castle beginning to wake, footsteps somewhere above her, a door in the corridor swinging shut, the faint clatter of the kitchens far below preparing for breakfast. She did not move to begin marking. The thing about grief, McGonagall had learned over the years, was that it did not always announce itself as grief. Sometimes it arrived disguised as something else entirely, as irritation or fatigue or a strange hollow feeling in the chest that could easily be mistaken for hunger if one was not paying attention. She had felt it first in 1970, when a former student had died in a Quidditch accident, a stupid, senseless accident with no war involved, nothing noble about it, just a boy who had flown too fast in the wrong conditions. She had marked 30 essays that evening and had not cried until 3 days later, suddenly and without warning, in the middle of correcting a second year's misuse of the word transfiguration. This morning she did not cry. She sat at her desk and looked at the stack of essays and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite anger and not quite despair, but contained elements of all three. It was the feeling of a sum that refused to add up correctly, no matter how many times you attempted it. She had been teaching for 22 years. In 22 years, she had taught a great many students. She did not keep a tally. That would have been morbid, and she was not given to morbid habits. But the number was not small. Many of them had gone on to do unremarkable things, which in most circumstances she considered a fine outcome. A few had done remarkable things. Some had disappointed her. Some had surprised her enormously, and a growing number, in the past 3 years especially, had ended up on a list that she did not look at directly, but that she kept, without intending to, in a part of her mind that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. 4 since June. She picked up the first essay, Douglas Hathaway, 3rd year, The Principles of Human Transfiguration, an introduction, and read the opening sentence. Transfiguration is a very hard subject, but also an interesting one in many ways. She set it back down. The question that had been forming since she opened the envelope, the question she had not yet let herself finish thinking, rose again, quietly, without drama. What, it asked, is the point? She was not a woman who asked herself such questions as a rule. She found philosophical despair to be largely self-indulgent, and she had very little patience for people who spent time questioning the value of things that were plainly valuable. Teaching was valuable. She knew that. She had known it since she first stood in front of a classroom at the age of 26, with 30 pairs of eyes looking at her, and had felt with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. But certainty, she was discovering, was not a permanent state. It was something you could possess entirely at 26 and then find at 48 that you had been quietly spending down without noticing, like money in an account you had never thought to check. She stood and went to the window again. The sky was the same color. The lake was still flat. Hagrid's light was out now. He would be making his way up to the castle for breakfast. She watched a pair of owls returning from their night routes, dropping toward the owlery tower, efficient and purposeful in the way that birds always seem to be. They had no interest in the question she was asking herself. They had no interest in Katrina Fawley, who had fought back in Ayrshire on a Tuesday evening and lost. She thought about the classroom she would walk into in 2 hours' time. 24 third years, all of them in some state of morning dishevelment, none of them yet aware of what was happening outside these walls. Or if they were aware only in the vague and abstract way that children are aware of large and frightening things, as weather rather than as fact. She would ask Douglas Hathaway why he had written The Transfiguration was interesting in many ways, without specifying a single way in which he found it interesting. She would give points to whoever had actually read the chapter she'd assigned. She would demonstrate the Vera Verto spell, and 24 students would attempt it with varying degrees of success, and she would correct their wand angles and remind them about the importance of clear intention in the casting. And by the end of the lesson, some of them would have made progress, and some would not. And 2 or 3 of them, in 5 or 7 or 10 years, might end up in a letter from someone at the ministry that was 4 sentences long. She pressed her lips together. This was not a thought she had allowed herself before, not in 22 years. She had sent them out, every year, every class, and she had trusted that what she had given them mattered. That transfiguration and courage and the particular values of Gryffindor House were things that would serve them. She had believed, without ever needing to articulate it, that teaching was its own argument, self-evidently necessary, self-evidently good. Now, standing at the window in the grey October light, she found that belief sitting not in its usual place, but slightly off-centre, as though someone had moved it in the night. Not gone, but moved, and she was not entirely sure how to return it to where it belonged, or whether it could simply be replaced once it had been shifted. The Morning Post arrived with the general noise of the great hall, which she could hear faintly from her office. The rush of wings, the low murmur of students, the scraping of benches. She did not go down to breakfast. She sat at her desk and read Douglas Hathaway's essay, which was exactly as thin as she had expected, and made careful notations in red ink because the notations were what she did, and she was not yet prepared to stop doing what she did simply because she was asking herself questions she had no immediate answers to. She wrote, "What are the ways in which you find Transfiguration interesting? Your introduction promises a discussion that your essay does not provide. See me." She set it aside and took the next one. This was from a girl named Eleanor Voss, also 3rd year, who had written 4 pages in a precise small hand and who, McGonagall noted, had clearly read not only the assigned chapter, but the 2 that followed it. She read it carefully. Eleanor Voss had a fine mind and had worked hard. She had explained the principles correctly, had drawn a reasonable distinction between animate and inanimate transfiguration, and had included a footnote in a 3rd year essay, questioning whether the classification of semi-animate objects was sufficiently rigorous in the current literature. McGonagall wrote, "Excellent. The footnote demonstrates precisely the kind of careful thinking this subject demands. 10 points to Gryffindor." She set it aside. Eleanor Voss was 11 years old. She had, if the odds held, 7 more years at Hogwarts. She would learn things here. Not just transfiguration, not just magic, but something harder to name. Something that had to do with how to think and how to question and how to persist when the answer did not come immediately. McGonagall had believed for 22 years that this mattered. She still believed it. She thought she still believed it. But believing a thing and being certain of it, she was learning this. Morning were not always the same. She pulled the 3rd essay toward her. Outside, the grey sky had begun, finally, to make up its mind. A thin rain was touching the glass of the window, so light it was barely sound, barely more than the suggestion of weather. She could hear her own fire behind her. and the distant institutional rhythm of the castle settling into its morning. She had a class in 2 hours. She picked up her red ink pen and continued marking. The third years arrived the way third years always arrived, in a loose, slightly chaotic cluster, trailing bag straps and half-finished conversations, sorting themselves into seats with the unconscious territorial precision of students who had long since claimed their preferred positions. McGonagall stood at the front of the classroom and watched them settle, as she had watched hundreds of classes settle before them, and waited for the feeling that usually came at this point. It did not come. The feeling she was waiting for was not dramatic. It was not excitement, precisely, or satisfaction, or any of the larger emotions that one might associate with a vocation. It was quieter than that, a small, reliable sense of rightness, the feeling of a thing clicking into its proper place. She had felt it on the first day of every term for 22 years, standing at the front of this room, waiting for the noise to subside. It was as dependable as the tide, and she had never once questioned whether it would be there. This morning it was not there. In its place was something closer to absence, not hostility toward the students, nothing as sharp as that, but a kind of flatness, as though the room had been drained of whatever quality usually made it feel like the right place to be. She clasped her hands behind her back and said, "Settle down." They settled. "Today," she said, moving to the blackboard, "we will be returning to switching spells. Specifically, the problem most of you demonstrated last Thursday of failing to maintain a clear mental image of the target state throughout the full duration of the incantation." She wrote "Vera Verto" on the board in precise capital letters. "Mr. Hathaway," she did not look at him, "would you summarize the core principle of a switching spell for the class?" A pause. The particular quality of this pause told her everything she needed to know about whether Douglas Hathaway had done the reading. She turned. He was a broad-shouldered boy with an expression of determined optimism that she suspected he deployed whenever he had not prepared adequately and was hoping that goodwill might substitute for knowledge. "It's when you," he began, "switch the properties of things between them." "Admirably vague," McGonagall said. "Miss Voss." Eleanor Voss sat 2 rows back and had her textbook open, though McGonagall noted she was not looking at it. "A switching spell transposes the defining characteristics of 2 objects simultaneously," she said. "The caster must hold a precise image of both the original and target states, and the spell fails if either image becomes imprecise during casting." "Correct. 5 points to Gryffindor." McGonagall turned back to the board. "The operative word, which Miss Voss has correctly identified, is simultaneously. The spell does not work in sequence. You are not first imagining the original and then the target. You are holding both at once in the same moment of concentration. This is what most of you failed to do on Thursday. Your minds moved in sequence, and your results were accordingly incomplete." She lifted her wand and directed it at the cabinet beside her desk, from which she had earlier removed a row of identical small objects, a collection of wooden beetles, each about the size of a walnut, that she had been using for switching practice since 1968. "You will each take 1 beetle. You will switch its surface texture, wood to glass, without altering its shape, color, or weight. They Incantation is on the board. You have 30 minutes. I will come to each of you in turn. She distributed the beetles without ceremony. They were small and smooth in her hand, worn with use, familiar. She had held hundreds of them over the years. She had watched hundreds of students hold them with the particular concentration of someone attempting to do something their brain did not yet know how to do. That visible, effortful quality of early learning, the face slightly tense, the wand held just a little too tightly. She walked the rows and watched them try. The lesson was technically satisfactory. 7 students achieved a partial switch within the first 15 minutes, which was a reasonable proportion for a third-year class, working on a skill that required a kind of mental dexterity that took time to develop. Eleanor Voss achieved a full switch in 11 minutes, examined the result critically, and then, without being asked, attempted to reverse it, which was not part of the exercise, but showed the quality of thinking McGonagall had noted in her essay. She said nothing to Eleanor Voss about this, but she awarded another 3 points. Douglas Hathaway's beetle remained entirely wooden at the 20-minute mark. "Mr. Hathaway," she said, stopping beside him, "show me your wand movement." He demonstrated. It was imprecise in the way that suggested he was thinking about the movement itself, rather than the intention behind it, a common error and a correctable one. "You are conducting," she said, "not casting. The wand movement is a vehicle for intention, not a performance. Stop thinking about your hand. Think about the beetle." He tried again. The beetle shimmered very slightly, the surface catching light differently for a fraction of a second before returning to plain wood. "Better," she said. "Again." She moved on. This was what teaching looked like from the outside, she thought, as she made her way down the row. Correction and repetition, and small increments of progress. A boy learning not to think about his hand. A girl attempting something she had not been asked to attempt, because her mind naturally moved forward. 24 students in various stages of understanding a single, precise skill that would eventually become automatic if they continued, if they practiced, if they chose to stay, if they stayed. She stopped the thought there. It was not productive. At the 25-minute mark, she called them to attention and asked 3 students to demonstrate their results. The first, a Hufflepuff girl named Moira Thatch, had achieved a clean switch and held it up for inspection with the slightly self-conscious pride of someone who had worked hard and wanted this to be noticed without quite wanting to appear as though they wanted it to be noticed. McGonagall examined the beetle, glass-surfaced, unchanged in every other respect, and said, "Well done. This is correct." The second student, a Ravenclaw boy, had switched the texture but also inadvertently altered the weight, which was a predictable error and gave her an opportunity to revisit the point about simultaneous rather than sequential intention. She did so concisely. The third was Douglas Hathaway, who had, in the final 5 minutes, managed a partial switch that was more than a shimmer, but less than a full transformation. The surface was somewhere between wood and glass, cloudy, translucent in patches. Not quite either. "This is progress," McGonagall said. She meant it. It was progress. She was not in the habit of saying things she did not mean. But standing there, looking at Douglas Hathaway's half-transformed beetle, she was aware of a thought running parallel to the lesson. Quiet, persistent, refusing to be entirely set aside. She was thinking about Katrina Fawley, who had sat in this classroom, who had struggled with switching spells, who had come on 3 Tuesday evenings until she had mastered them, who had left with 7 OWLs and a handshake, who had been 23 years old on Tuesday evening in Ayrshire. Had the switching spells helped? Had any of it helped? She dismissed the class at precisely the right time, with an assignment, 2 inches on the relationship between mental clarity and spell precision. That was exactly the assignment this lesson required. She said what needed to be said. She did what needed to be done. The students packed their bags and filed out in the usual loosely organized manner, voices rising as they crossed the threshold into the corridor where the rules of classroom decorum no longer applied. She was erasing the board when she heard a voice. Professor McGonagall. She turned. A boy was standing in the doorway. One of hers, a third-year Gryffindor named Thomas Aldridge, slight and fair-haired, with the careful manner of someone who had been raised to be polite and had not yet decided whether politeness was an asset or a liability. He was holding his bag with both hands and looking at her with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and hesitation. Mr. Aldridge, the class is dismissed. I know. I had a question about the advanced application of the switching principle. He seemed to weigh his words as he said it, as though he had rehearsed this opening, but was not entirely confident of where it led. I was reading ahead. There's a section in Chapter 9 about switching between categories, not just surface texture, but fundamental properties, like switching the animacy of an object. And I wasn't sure if that was actually possible, or if the textbook was theoretical, McGonagall said. Within the school curriculum, cross-category switching of that nature is NEWT level material. Chapter 9 is included for completeness, not as a guide to current practice. But it's possible. She looked at him. He was 11, maybe 12, standing in an emptying classroom in 1980 with a textbook question and genuine curiosity and a future that she could not see clearly from where she stood. With sufficient mastery of the underlying principle, she said, and appropriate training, yes, it is possible. Could you teach it? I mean, is it something that gets taught here, eventually? If you continue your studies to NEWT level and demonstrate the required proficiency, yes. He nodded. Not the performative nodding of a student filing away a fact for later retrieval, but something more considered, the nod of someone actually thinking about what they'd heard, turning it over. Right, he said. Okay, thank you, Professor. He left. McGonagall stood in the empty classroom with the eraser still in her hand. She had answered correctly. She had given him accurate information, appropriate to his level, directed toward his actual question. It was the answer she would have given on any other morning, in any other year, without hesitation. But walking back toward her desk, she noticed something that she could not immediately account for. She had answered him from a distance, not physically. She had been standing perfectly close, perfectly attentive, but from somewhere inside the answer, she had been slightly elsewhere, present in all the ways that could be observed and absent in some way that could not. She set the eraser down. The classroom was quiet now. 24 wooden beetles sat in their row on the cabinet, waiting to be collected and returned to their box, smooth and worn and entirely patient, in the way that objects are patient, which is to say, without any awareness of waiting at all. The blackboard was half erased. The morning light, still grey, still unconvinced, came through the high windows and lay across the floor in long, flat rectangles. She stood in the middle of her classroom and looked at it. 22 years of this room. She knew every corner of it, every draft, the particular squeak of the third floor board from the door, the way the light shifted from the east windows to the west over the course of a day. She had raised her voice in this room and lowered it. She had given detentions and awarded points and demonstrated spells so many times that the wand movements were entirely automatic, requiring no thought whatsoever, the body simply doing what it knew to do. It had never felt hollow before. That was the word, not empty. The room was full of its usual objects, its usual order, the residue of 24 students who had been here an hour ago and would be replaced tomorrow by another 24. But hollow, as though the room's contents were all present, but the thing that usually gave them weight was somewhere else this morning, attending to other business, and had left behind only the form of things without their substance. She was aware that this was not the room's failing. She collected the beetles and put them in their box, one by one, and placed the box in the cabinet. She straightened the chairs that had been left at angles. She picked up 2 pieces of chalk that had rolled to the floor and replaced them in the tray. These were small acts, routine acts, the maintenance of order that was as much a part of teaching as the lessons themselves. She performed them carefully. She performed them correctly. And when she was done, she stood for one more moment in the doorway of her classroom, looking back at it, and felt the hollow feeling settle in her chest like something that had decided, without her permission, to stay. Then she turned and walked into the corridor, her footsteps precise and unhurried, toward whatever the morning required of her next. Dumbledore's door was open. This was not unusual. Albus Dumbledore operated, as a general principle, with his door open, a habit that McGonagall had always considered either a gesture of genuine accessibility or a very elegant form of surveillance, depending on her mood. This morning, she stood in the corridor outside it for a moment, longer than necessary, her hand not quite raised to knock, and considered turning back. She had not come here to talk about Katrina Fawley. She had come, she reminded herself, because she needed to discuss the scheduling conflict between the 5th-year Transfiguration practical and the Quidditch pitch reservation that Madame Hooch had filed for the same Friday afternoon. It was a routine matter. It required perhaps 4 minutes of conversation and a minor administrative adjustment. She knocked. "Come in, Minerva." He was seated behind his desk, which was in its usual state of magnificent disorder. Towers of parchment that somehow never fell, objects of uncertain purpose arranged with the apparent randomness of things that are in fact precisely where they are meant to be, and the pensive sitting to one side, its surface currently still. Fawkes was on his perch, watching her arrival with the serene indifference of a creature that has lived long enough to find most things unremarkable. Dumbledore looked up from whatever he was reading and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down." "I won't keep you long," McGonagall said, sitting. "It's the Friday timetable. The 5th-year practical is scheduled for 2 o'clock, and Hooch has filed a pitch reservation for the same slot. One of them will need to move, and I thought it easier to resolve it here than to leave it to the general notice board." "Of course," Dumbledore said. He made no move to consult any timetable. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at her with the expression she had known for 22 years and had never entirely learned to read. Attentive and mild and containing, she had always suspected several more layers than were visible from the surface. "The practical can move to Thursday," she said, "if the astronomy tower is free." "I believe it is." "Then that resolves it." "Good." He did not move. "How are your classes this term?" McGonagall recognized the question for what it was, or rather, she recognized that it might be more than it appeared, and chose to answer the surface of it. "The third years are coming along. The fifth years are beginning to show the usual pre-OWL anxiety, which I expect will intensify after Christmas. The seventh years are capable on the whole. And you?" She met his eyes. "I beg your pardon?" "How are you, Minerva? Not the classes. You." The fire crackled behind him. Fawkes shifted on his perch with a small liquid sound. McGonagall held Dumbledore's gaze for a moment, and then looked at the desk. Not evasively, but with the deliberate quality of someone deciding precisely how much to say. "I received a letter this morning," she said, "from Hestia Prewett." Dumbledore's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted, a deepening, perhaps, of his attention. "Katrina Fawley," McGonagall said. A brief silence. "I know," Dumbledore said quietly. "I received word last night. She was 23. "Yes." McGonagall looked at the desk. There was a small brass instrument near the edge of it, spinning very slowly on its axis, emitting a thin thread of silver smoke that rose and dissolved before it reached the ceiling. She watched it for a moment. "She struggled with switching spells in her third year," McGonagall said. "She came to my office 3 Tuesday evenings. She didn't ask for help. She simply appeared and worked until she had mastered it. I thought that said something about her." "It did," Dumbledore said. "It said she was the kind of person who didn't give up when something was difficult." McGonagall paused. "And then she went to Ayrshire on a Tuesday evening, and it turned out that persistence is not always sufficient." Dumbledore said nothing. This, she had learned, was deliberate. He was not a man who filled silences out of discomfort, and the silences he left were rarely empty. They were more like spaces he was offering, which you could choose to step into or not. She did not step into this one immediately. "It's the 4th since June," she said, after a moment. "I know." "At what point?" She stopped, began again, more carefully. "I have been asking myself this morning whether what we do here is sufficient preparation for what they are walking into." "And what answer have you arrived at?" "I haven't." She said it plainly, without apology. "That is the difficulty." Dumbledore unfolded his hands and leaned back very slightly in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, not in thought she had come to understand, but in the particular way he looked at things when he was about to say something he had considered carefully. "When I was young," he said, "I was quite certain that education was the solution to most of the world's significant problems. I believed that with sufficient knowledge and the right values instilled early enough, the worst of human and wizarding nature could be overcome." He paused. "I was wrong about that in certain important respects. Knowledge and values are not armor. They do not guarantee survival. No, McGonagall agreed, with some dryness. I had noticed. The corner of Dumbledore's mouth moved very slightly. What they do, he continued, is considerably harder to measure. They determine not whether a person survives, but what a person does with the life they have. Katrina Fawley fought back. You noted that? Hestia Prewett noted it, in 4 sentences. Nevertheless, he looked at her directly. The question of whether teaching matters is not answered by survival rates, Minerva. It never has been. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. That is a reasonable argument, she said. I am aware that it is a reasonable argument. I made a version of it myself this morning to a student who asked me whether learning magic still mattered when dark wizards existed. She paused. And I believed it less than I would have believed it a year ago. Dumbledore regarded her with an expression that was not pity and not concern precisely, but something adjacent to both, a kind of serious regard that acknowledged what she had said without rushing to correct it. That is honest, he said. Yes, I would not ask you to believe it more than you currently do, he said. Belief that is forced is not belief. It is performance, which is not particularly useful. No, he agreed, not particularly. Another silence. The small instrument continued its slow rotation. Fawkes made a low sound, almost inaudible. Not the brilliant ascending song he produced in moments of significance, but something quieter, private almost, as though he was simply noting that he was present. McGonagall looked at Dumbledore. "You're not going to tell me what to think about this?" she said. It was not a question. No. Or what to do. That is not mine to determine. She considered this. In 22 years of working alongside Albus Dumbledore, she had had many conversations in this office on topics ranging from the trivial to the genuinely consequential, and she had long since learned that he operated according to a principle she had never entirely made her peace with. He would tell you what he knew, and he would occasionally tell you what he thought, but he would very rarely tell you what to do, and he would never tell you what to feel. It was a quality she respected and found, at certain moments, profoundly unhelpful. This was one of those moments. The school, she said, choosing her words carefully, is filling up every year with students who will walk out into a world that is becoming more dangerous and not less. We prepare them for examinations and for careers and for life in a general and hopeful sense, and they go out and some of them are killed, and we receive 4-sentence letters from contacts at the ministry, and the following morning we stand in front of the next class and demonstrate switching spells. Yes, Dumbledore said, we do. And you find that sufficient. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with a care that told her he was not reaching for comfort. I find it necessary, he said. Whether it is sufficient is a question I do not believe any of us are positioned to answer. We are inside the thing we are trying to evaluate. That makes objectivity on the question of sufficiency essentially impossible. He looked at her steadily. What I know is that stopping is not neutral. Stopping has consequences of its own. McGonagall said nothing. I am not saying this to persuade you of anything, he added. I am saying it because it is true, and I think you are someone who prefers true things to comfortable ones. Generally, yes. Then I will add only this. He leaned forward slightly. What you are feeling this morning is not weakness, and it is not error. It is the appropriate response of a person who takes their work seriously enough to feel it when the work does not save everyone it should. He paused. I would be more concerned if you felt nothing. McGonagall held his gaze for a long moment. Then she stood, straightening her robes with the habitual precision of someone for whom the maintenance of outward composure was both a discipline and, on certain mornings, an act of will. The fifth-year practical will move to Thursday, she said. I'll let Phileas know about the astronomy tower, Dumbledore replied, as though the last 20 minutes had been a natural extension of the scheduling question she had arrived with. She was at the door when he spoke again. Minerva. She turned. He was looking at her with that same steady, layered expression, the one she could never fully read, and had stopped trying to. She came on 3 Tuesday evenings, he said, without being asked. McGonagall looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and walked into the corridor, her footsteps measured and precise, and did not allow herself to think about it again until she was entirely alone. The Hogwarts staff room at 11:30 on a Wednesday morning was rarely a place of philosophical debate. It was, more typically, a place of marked essays and cold tea and the particular kind of exhausted collegiality that develops among people who have spent the morning managing other people's children. The chairs nearest the fireplace were claimed by unspoken consensus. Horace Slughorn had occupied the largest armchair on the left for so many years that the cushion had permanently assumed the shape of him, and the side table by the window held a teapot that was charmed to stay warm, but somehow never quite managed it, producing instead a beverage that was technically tea in the same way that a puddle was technically water. McGonagall poured herself a cup and sat at the far end of the room with the fifth-year essays she had collected before lunch. She did not particularly want the tea. She wanted something to do with her hands, and the essays were already in her bag, and the Jazana staff room was warmer than her office. And she had found, over the course of the morning, that being alone with her own thoughts was producing diminishing returns. She uncapped her pen and opened the first essay. At the table near the window, 2 of the younger staff members were talking. She was not listening initially. The voices were present in the way that background sounds are present, registering without being processed, part of the general texture of the room. She was reading a 5th year's opening argument about the limitations of switching spells on living tissue, which was the correct topic, but was being approached with the kind of confident imprecision that suggested the student had understood the broad principle and was hoping that enthusiasm might compensate for accuracy. She wrote a marginal note. Can't honestly say the parents aren't right to be worried. This was a man's voice, young or youngish. She placed it after a moment. Edmund Reeves, who had joined the staff 2 years ago to teach Muggle studies. She did not know him well. He was earnest and prepared his lessons carefully and had, so far as she could tell, no strong opinions about anything except the importance of his subject, which he defended with a polite persistence that she respected, even when she found it slightly exhausting. Worried is one thing, a woman's voice now. Elspeth Carroway, Defense Against the Dark Arts, in her first year at Hogwarts, and already showing the particular strain that the post reliably produced in its occupants. Acting on it is another. I'm not saying acting on it. I'm saying when a family writes to ask whether their child is safe here, what do we tell them? What is the honest answer? McGonagall kept her eyes on the essay. The honest answer, Carraway said, is that they're safer here than they would be at home, in most cases. In most cases, yes, but that's doing a lot of work, that phrase. A pause. The fire popped. Someone in the corridor, outside, walked past with a quick, heavy step. Slughorn, possibly, from the sound of it. The argument I keep hearing, Reeves said, and his voice had dropped slightly, not to a whisper, but to the register of someone who was being careful, is that keeping the school open is the right thing to do because it gives children a sense of normalcy, routine, structure, and I understand that argument. I don't dismiss it. But I wonder sometimes whether we're giving them normalcy or whether we're giving them the appearance of normalcy, which is a different thing. And I wonder whether the appearance of normalcy, when the situation is genuinely not normal, is a kindness or something else. McGonagall's pen was still. She was looking at the essay, but no longer reading it. You think we're lying to them, Carraway said. I think we might be allowing them to believe something that makes our jobs easier and their lives feel more manageable in the short term, without properly accounting for what they're walking into. A pause. And I think there is a version of hope that is actually just avoidance, dressed up as optimism. The fire settled. Outside, a distant bell marked the midday hour. And what's the alternative? Carraway asked. Tell them the truth. Sit down with a group of 13-year-olds and explain to them precisely what is happening out there. What that does to a child. I'm not suggesting that. Then what are you suggesting? Reeves was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was slower, more careful, as though he was working something out as he said it, rather than reporting a position he had already formed. I suppose I'm asking whether keeping this place running, teaching them switching spells and awarding house points and sending them home for Christmas, whether that prepares them for anything real, or whether it just postpones the moment when reality arrives. He paused, and I'm asking whether the fact that it's what we've always done is a sufficient reason to keep doing it. A long silence. McGonagall became aware that she was holding her pen with enough pressure to leave marks on the page that had nothing to do with her editorial notations. She relaxed her grip. I think, Carraway said finally, and her voice was quieter now, less combative, the voice of someone who was genuinely considering rather than arguing, that hope is not the same as avoidance. I think those two things can look similar from the outside and be entirely different in substance. A pause. I think when you teach a child to think clearly and to question and to act with integrity even when it's uncomfortable, you are preparing them for reality, even if the lessons look ordinary, even if it looks like switching spells and the house points, even if some of them don't make it. A beat of silence. Yes, Carraway said. Even then. McGonagall set her pen down on the table, quietly, without calling attention to the gesture. She was aware that neither Reeves nor Carraway had any idea she was sitting 10 feet away. The staff room was arranged in a way that made the far end genuinely separate from the window table. High-backed chairs and a freestanding bookshelf created a partial division that stopped well short of a wall, but went far enough to produce the illusion of privacy. She had sat in this corner often enough to know that conversations at the window table carried in the way that conversations in a room often carry further than their speakers intend, and she had never before found herself in possession of one that she was not sure how to set down. She looked at the essay in front of her without reading it. Reeves was not wrong, she thought. That was the difficulty. He was asking real questions, questions that deserved genuine engagement, not reassurance. And he was asking them in good faith, from the position of someone who cared about the students in his classroom and was not satisfied with comfortable answers. She could not dismiss what he had said simply because it was uncomfortable to hear. And Caraway was not wrong either. The distinction she had drawn between hope and avoidance was a real distinction and a necessary one, and it pointed at something that McGonagall had believed for 22 years without ever having to articulate it quite so plainly. When you teach a child to think clearly and to question and to act with integrity even when it's uncomfortable, you are preparing them for reality. She had believed that. She still believed it, in the part of herself that believed things not because she had recently argued herself into them, but because they had been tested and had held. But believing a thing was not the same, this morning, as feeling its truth with any immediacy. The belief was present. The feeling of its truth was muffled, as though heard through a wall. She picked up her pen again and looked at the essay. The student, a fifth year, named Robert Cairns, had written in his third paragraph, "The principle of switching therefore has limits that are not always visible until they are encountered in practice, which suggests that theoretical understanding and practical application are not the same thing and should not be treated as equivalent." McGonagall read this sentence twice. It was, she noted, quite a good sentence for a fifth year, and almost certainly accidental in the specific way the students sometimes arrived at genuine insight without knowing that was what they had done. She wrote in the margin, "This is a correct and important observation. Develop it further." She moved to the next paragraph. Reeves and Caraway had lowered their voices after a while, and their conversation had moved on to other things, timetabling, a shared complaint about the state of the staff room's tea supply, a brief and inconclusive discussion about whether the library's restricted section was adequately supervised. The ordinary texture of a staff room morning had resumed, and the brief quality of genuine weight that had entered the room had dispersed, as such qualities tend to do, into the general business of the day. McGonagall finished her tea. It was, as always, not quite the right temperature. She worked through 2 more essays with reasonable efficiency. Both were adequate. Neither was as interesting as Robert Cairns' accidental insight or Eleanor Voss's footnote. They were competent, careful responses from students who had understood what was asked of them and had provided it. There was nothing wrong with them. There was nothing that required her particular attention. She found herself thinking, without intending to, about the word sufficient. Dumbledore had used it, or rather, he had declined to use it. He had said necessary and refused sufficient, and she had understood the distinction, but had perhaps not yet fully examined it. A thing could be necessary without being sufficient. Teaching was necessary. She believed that in the deep structural way that she believed in gravity and the importance of proper wand technique, but sufficient. Sufficient To what end? Sufficient to protect them? No. Dumbledore had said as much. Sufficient to prepare them. For what, precisely? For the world as it was, not as it ought to be. She capped her pen and gathered the essays into a neat stack. Around her, the staff room continued its ordinary business. A second-year girl knocked on the door and delivered a note for Professor Flitwick, who was not present. Reeves left for his afternoon class with a brief, polite nod in her direction. He had not known she was there for the conversation, and there was nothing in his expression that suggested otherwise. Caraway refilled her tea and stayed at the window table with a stack of her own marking, her face bent over the page in concentration. McGonagall stood, straightened her robes, and moved toward the door. She stopped when she reached it, not because anything had arrested her physically, but because she paused for just a moment in the space of the doorway, the place between the room and the corridor, between one part of the morning and the next. Hope is not the same as avoidance, Caraway had said. McGonagall held that thought for exactly as long as it took to step through the door. Then she was in the corridor, and the staff room was behind her, and the afternoon was ahead, and the question she was carrying had not been answered, but had been, perhaps, more precisely named. The fifth years were her last class of the day. They arrived in the particular state that fifth years reliably occupied in October, aware, in a way that younger students were not, that the OWL examinations were no longer abstract future events, but actual approaching realities, and carrying this awareness with the mixture of determination and low-grade anxiety that McGonagall had observed in every fifth-year cohort she had ever taught. They were focused in the brittle, slightly overwound way of people who were working hard, but were not yet certain that working hard would be enough. She did not find this unpleasant. She had always thought that a certain amount of healthy anxiety was a reasonable response to an examination that actually mattered, and she had very little sympathy for the school of thought that said students should be protected from the feeling of genuine stakes. The OWLs had stakes. The students knew it. This seemed to her entirely appropriate. She set them to work on a timed practical, individually transfiguring a series of objects with increasing complexity, working through the sequence without assistance, which was as close to examination conditions as she could produce in the classroom. The room settled into the focused quiet of concentrated effort, broken only by the occasional soft sound of a spell completing or failing, and the rustle of someone moving to the next object in the sequence. She moved through the room at intervals, observing without commenting, unless a student was making a technical error significant enough to constitute a bad habit in the making. Mostly, she watched. They were good, on the whole. Not uniformly. There were two students whose wand control remained imprecise in ways that would cost them under examination pressure, and she made notes about both. But as a cohort, they were solid, and several of them were better than solid. A girl named Patricia Huang worked through the sequence with a quiet, methodical efficiency that McGonagall found genuinely impressive. A boy named Simon Ashby had what she privately considered the most natural instinct for transfiguration of anyone she had taught in the past 4 years. An intuitive sense of the underlying logic that most students only arrived at through extended practice. She watched Simon Ashby complete the fourth object in the sequence, a copper disc into a functioning compass. With a wand, movement so economical it barely registered, and thought, "This one is going to be excellent." And then, immediately, and without intending it, "I hope he is still here to be excellent." She moved away from him before the thought could complete itself into anything more specific. The practical ran for 40 minutes. When she called time, the room exhaled, a collective release of concentration that was almost audible, and the students set down their wands and looked up with the slightly dazed expressions of people returning from a place of intense focus. "Leave your sequences on the desk," she said. "I will review them before Thursday. Those of you who did not complete the full sequence." She looked at 2 specific students who received the look with appropriate solemnity. "I expect to see a completed set during Thursday's session. That is not a request." She dismissed them. They packed with the slightly faster energy of students at the end of a school day, the conversations starting before they had fully left their seats, the social world reasserting itself over the academic one with the speed that never failed to slightly amaze her. In 3 minutes, the room was empty except for the objects of the practical still laid out on the desks and the sound of voices fading down the corridor, except that when she turned from the board, one student was still present. He was sitting in the second row, not standing, as Thomas Aldrich had stood that morning, with the posture of someone who had an academic question and knew the correct form for asking it. This student was sitting as though he had not yet made the decision to leave, as though leaving was something that required more resolution than he currently possessed. His name was James Holloway. He was in his 5th year, a Gryffindor, unremarkable in his academic performance, not poor, not distinguished, somewhere in the middle of the cohort where the majority of students quietly resided. He had completed 3 objects in the practical sequence, which was adequate but not comfortable. He had dark eyes and a thoughtful face, and he was looking at his hands on the desk in front of him. McGonagall waited. After a moment, without looking up, he said, "Professor, can I ask you something?" "You may," she said. A pause. He seemed to be organizing something internally, not nervousness exactly, but the careful assembly of a question that had more weight than the average question and needed to be carried correctly. "My dad wrote to me," he said, "last week. He didn't say much, just he mentioned some things that had happened near where we live. And my cousin is in the Aura office. And my mum said in her letter that she doesn't hear from him as much as she used to." He stopped, started again. "And I was sitting in the practical just now, doing the compass, and I thought, does this actually matter? Does it help anything when we learn this?" He looked up at her finally. "Does learning magic actually make a difference? When the people doing the worst things already know more magic than we do?" The room was quiet. McGonagall looked at him steadily. James Holloway, 5th year, Gryffindor, with a cousin in the Aura office who had stopped writing as often as he used to. She said, "The purpose of your education is not to make you equivalent to a fully trained dark wizard in your 5th year. It is to give you a foundation, technical competence, critical thinking, the ability to act under pressure that will serve you throughout your life. What you learn here is not a weapon, it is a capacity." She heard herself say it. The words were correct. They were the right words, accurately chosen, representing a genuine position that she had held for 22 years and had defended when necessary, and had never before had cause to doubt in any structural way. James Holloway listened to them with the expression of someone receiving an answer that is satisfactory and does not quite reach the place the question came from. "Right," he said. "Yes, that makes sense." He nodded slowly. "It's just, sometimes it feels like we're in here learning to turn compasses back into copper discs, and out there people are." He stopped himself, pressed his lips together briefly. "Sorry, that's not a fair comparison." "No," McGonagall said. "It is a fair comparison. The comparison is accurate. The question you are asking is a real one." He looked at her, slightly surprised, as though he had expected either dismissal or reassurance, and had not prepared for acknowledgement. "The answer," she continued, "is that a fair comparison is not always a complete one. What you do in this room and what happens outside it are not the same activity, and they are not designed to be. They are connected differently than that." She paused. "The fact that the connection is not simple does not mean it does not exist." Another careful nod. She could see him taking this apart, examining it. He was, she thought, a more careful thinker than his examination results suggested, which was not uncommon. Some students thought more carefully in conversation than on parchment. "Is your family safe?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, without preamble. "I think so," he said. "My dad said not to worry, so probably yes. Or possibly he didn't want to. Yes, I think so." "Good." She held his gaze for a moment. "If that changes, you may come to me." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief. Something quieter than either of those, closer to the simple registering of a fact, that she had said it and meant it. "Thank you, Professor," he said. He gathered his bag and left with a steadier step than he had arrived with, which she noted and said nothing about. She stood in the empty classroom for the second time that day. The objects from the practical were still arranged on the desks. Copper discs and carved wooden blocks and the small glass spheres she used for the third exercise, each one sitting precisely where it had been left, in various states of completion. The compass Simon Ashby had made was in the fourth position on his desk, perfectly formed, functional, the needle pointing north, with a reliability she had verified without comment when she passed. It sat there now, still pointing north, indifferent to whether anyone was looking. She had answered James Holloway correctly. She knew that she had answered him correctly, because the answer was correct. It was accurate. It was considered. It reflected a position she genuinely held. She had not invented it for his benefit, or softened it for his age, or constructed it from the outside in. It was what she believed. And walking toward his desk now, picking up the copper disc he had not finished transfiguring, cool and flat in her hand, a small circle of weight, she confronted, for the third time today, and with more clarity than the first two, a distinction she had been avoiding since 8 o'clock that morning. She had answered him from behind glass, not dishonestly, not incorrectly, but from a place slightly removed from her own conviction, the way you could recite something true that you had temporarily lost access to, the way a person with perfect musical memory could play a piece note for note while feeling none of the music. The notes were right. The music was somewhere else. She set the copper disc down. James Holloway had asked whether learning magic made a difference when the worst people already knew more of it. She had told him that education was capacity, not equivalence, that the connection between this room and the world outside was real, but not simple. She had believed it when she said it in the way that she believed in things she had not recently examined, which was not, she recognized, the same as believing it with her whole attention. And that, the gap between those two kinds of belief, was precisely what the day had been widening, incrementally, since the moment she opened a 4-sentence letter in the grey October morning and felt the sum refuse, once again, to add up. She collected the objects from the desks and replaced them in their cases with the methodical care of long habit, each one in its correct position. The cases latched and returned to the cabinet. Then she picked up her bag and her robes and walked to the door. The corridor was nearly empty at this hour. A few distant voices, the sound of someone on the floor above, the ordinary late afternoon sounds of a school settling toward evening. She stood in the doorway for a moment, as she had stood in the staff room doorway at midday in the between space. James Holloway had a cousin who had stopped writing as often as he used to. She walked into the corridor and did not let herself finish the thought, but it followed her, quietly and without hurry, all the way back to her office. The letter had written itself in her head somewhere between the corridor and her office door. She had not intended this. It was not a decision she had arrived at through any deliberate process, not a conclusion she had reasoned toward, step by careful step, the way she reasoned toward most things. It had simply been there when she sat down at her desk, the way a word sometimes surfaces in the mind fully formed, without the visible machinery of its construction. She knew what she wanted to say. She knew, approximately, to whom it should be addressed. She knew the tone, not emotional, not bitter, not elaborate in its explanation, simply factual. A resignation letter written in the voice of someone who had thought carefully and reached a considered conclusion and was prepared to act on it. She took a piece of parchment from the second drawer. She uncapped her pen. To the headmaster, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. She stopped. The fire was lit. Someone from the household staff came through in the late afternoon to see to the fires in the teaching offices, one of the small institutional courtesies she had absorbed so completely into the texture of her days that she rarely noticed it anymore. She noticed it now. The warmth at her back, the quiet sound of burning, the way the light it cast moved very slightly across the surface of her desk. She looked at the line she had written, to the headmaster. In 22 years, she had written that address at the top of dozens of documents, requests, reports, formal notifications of student conduct, the occasional letter requiring Dumbledore's counter-signature for administrative purposes. She had written it without any particular weight attached to the words. It was simply the correct form of address for the correct recipient. This morning, this evening now, the grey October sky outside her window finally darkening toward proper night, it carried weight she did not normally permit words to carry. She set the pen to the parchment and wrote, "After considerable reflection, I am writing to tender my resignation from my position as Transfiguration Professor, effective at the end of the current term. This decision has not been made lightly, nor does it reflect any dissatisfaction with the institution itself. It reflects, rather, My honest assessment that I am no longer certain I am serving the purpose this position requires. She stopped again, read it back. It was, she noted, a well-constructed sentence, precise, measured, free of self-pity. It said exactly what she intended it to say, and nothing that she did not intend. She looked at it for a long time. The fire said nothing, which was appropriate, since fires are not in the habit of offering counsel. Outside, the last of the light had gone entirely, and the window was now simply dark glass, giving back a dim reflection of the room, her desk, the lamp, the edge of her own face, compressed and slightly indistinct in the way of reflections that are not their subject's primary concern. She thought about Dumbledore's words from the morning, not the philosophical ones. Not belief that is forced is not belief, or the careful distinction between necessary and sufficient. But the last thing he had said, the thing he had said as she was leaving. She came on 3 Tuesday evenings, without being asked. She had understood in the moment that he was not simply offering a memory. He was offering something more specific, a reminder that what she did here left marks that could not always be measured by outcome, that Katrina Fawley's persistence, her 3 Tuesday evenings of quiet, determined effort, was something she had carried with her, that it had been given to her in this castle, in a classroom very much like the one McGonagall had stood in twice today, by someone who had simply shown up and continued to show up and trusted that it mattered. McGonagall had understood this. She had understood it and walked into the corridor and spent the rest of the day carrying a hollow feeling in her chest that understanding had not filled. Understanding, she thought, was not always sufficient either. She looked at the resignation letter. What she was afraid of, and she permitted herself this word here in the privacy of her own office with no one present to observe the admission, was not the grief. She had carried grief before, and she knew its dimensions, knew how it worked, knew that it was survivable even when it did not feel survivable. What she was afraid of was the specific quality of this morning's grief, which was not clean and direct, but tangled with something more corrosive. The possibility that grief, repeated enough times, would eventually erode something essential, that she would continue standing in front of classrooms and awarding points and correcting wand angles until the day she looked up and found she was performing all the correct actions from a place of complete internal absence. She was afraid, in other words, not of quitting, but of continuing without meaning it. And sitting here with the resignation letter in front of her and the fire at her back and the dark window returning her own indistinct reflection, she attempted to be honest with herself about which of those two things she was closer to. She thought about Thomas Aldridge that morning, standing in the doorway with his textbook question about cross-category switching, and the look on his face when she said, yes, it is possible. Not the look of a student filing away a fact, but the look of someone genuinely thinking about what it meant, turning it over, following it somewhere. She thought about Eleanor Voss and her footnote, 11 years old and already questioning whether the existing classification was sufficiently rigorous, already doing the thing that Hogwarts, at its best, was designed to produce, a mind that didn't stop at the edge of the question it had been given. She thought about James Holloway sitting at his desk with his hands flat on the surface, asking whether learning magic made a difference, and the way he had listened, not passively, not simply seeking reassurance, but listening in the careful way of someone who was going to take the answer somewhere and do something with it. She thought about Simon Ashby's compass, pointing north on an empty desk. These were not arguments. She was aware that they were not arguments, that they did not constitute a refutation of the question she had been asking all day, did not prove that teaching was sufficient, or that the connection between this room and the world outside was as strong as she needed it to be. They were not proof of anything, but they were real. They had happened today in the hours after she had opened a 4-sentence letter and felt the sum refuse to add up. They had happened while she was doubting, which meant the doubt had not made them impossible. She picked up the pen. She did not add to the letter. She held the pen over the parchment for a moment, not dramatically, not with any sense of a scene being constructed, but with the simple, focused attention of someone making a decision that had no audience and required none. Then she set the pen down to one side. She took the parchment in both hands. She held it for a moment, and then she turned and held it to the fire. It caught immediately, as parchment does, a clean edge of flame moving across the surface with a speed that felt, briefly, like commentary. The words went first, which she had not planned, but which seemed, in retrospect, correct. The careful sentences, the precise language, the honest assessment of her own uncertain sufficiency, all of it reduced to a brief, bright orange, and then to nothing, the ash falling apart in the grate before it could hold any shape. She watched it until it was done. Then she straightened in her chair and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire directly for the first time this evening. The hollow feeling was still present. She did not expect it to be gone. That was not how these things worked, and she was not naive enough to believe that a decision, even a correct one, immediately filled the space that doubt had made. The grief was still present too, sitting in its particular position in her chest. Katrina Fawley and the Mackintosh twins, and Yaxley's son, the 4-sentence letter in the top left drawer that she had not thrown away and would not. The questions she had been asking all day had not been answered. She did not expect them to be answered. But something had shifted in the way that things shift, not because anything external has changed, but because you have finally put your weight on a decision and felt it hold. She was not certain she was serving the purpose this position required, but she was, she thought. She believed imperfectly and without the full-throated conviction of her 26-year-old self, but with something more durable, something that had been tested today and had not broken. She was the person who should keep trying to serve it, not because it was safe, not because it was guaranteed to matter in the specific ways she needed it to matter, not because Dumbledore had said the right things, or Carraway's argument had resolved her doubts, or James Holloway's careful listening had been sufficient proof of anything, but because stopping had consequences of its own, and because the alternative to imperfect, doubting, grief-carrying teaching was not better teaching. It was absence, and absence was not neutral, and she had never in 22 years been a person who chose absence when presence was possible. She took a fresh piece of parchment from the drawer. She would write nothing on it tonight. She placed it on the desk simply because the desk looked wrong without something on it, and she was particular about such things. And some habits were worth keeping precisely because they were habits. Small insistences on order that asked nothing of belief and required nothing of conviction, and that held the shape of a life while the larger things found their way back to their proper positions. She capped her pen. Outside, Hogwarts was settling into its evening. She could hear the distant institutional sounds of it, the particular nighttime register of a building that was never entirely quiet and never entirely awake. Somewhere above her, a door closed. Somewhere below, the faint sound of the great hall beginning to fill for dinner. She had classes tomorrow. She sat at her desk in the firelight and did not yet move toward them, but held the knowledge of them quietly. The third years and their beetles, the fifth years and their sequences, the ordinary complicated work of teaching children in a world that was not arranging itself for their convenience, and let it be what it was, sufficient or not, necessary at least. She sat with that. The envelope was not there. McGonagall noticed this before she noticed anything else. Before the state of the sky outside the window, before the temperature of the room, before the sound of the castle beginning its morning. The desk was exactly as she had left it. The fresh parchment, the capped pen, the tartan tin, the class register open to Thursday's page. Nothing new, nothing that had arrived without announcement in the hours between last night and this morning. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking this in. Then she entered, set down her robes, and went to the window. The sky was different, not dramatically. It was still October, still the Scottish Highlands, still fundamentally a grey proposition. But yesterday's flat, non-committal colour had been replaced by something with more resolution in it, a cooler, cleaner light, coming in low from the east, the kind that arrives after a night of quiet weather and suggests that the sky has made a decision and intends to hold it. The Black Lake had a slight texture this morning, a faint wind moving across it from the north, breaking the surface into small, deliberate patterns. The Forbidden Forest was very still. Hagrid's light was on. She stood at the window longer than she had stood there yesterday, not because there was more to see, but because she was not in a hurry this morning in the same way she had been in a hurry yesterday, not running from her desk, not delaying the moment of sitting down, but simply standing because the window was there, and the morning was there, and she was, for the first time since opening Hestia Prewet's letter, not actively in the middle of a question. The question was still present. She did not imagine it had resolved itself overnight. Katrina Fawley was still 23 years old and still dead in Ayrshire, and the Mackintosh twins were still gone, and Yaxley's son was still gone, and the letter in the top left drawer had not been answered by anything that had happened yesterday. The world outside these walls was still what it was, grinding and dangerous, and not arranging itself according to anyone's wishes, least of all the wishes of the people most in need of its cooperation. But she had made a decision last night, and the decision had held through the night, and it was still holding now, and that, she had learned over 48 years, was the relevant test. Not how a decision felt when you made it, in the concentrated privacy of your own firelit office, but how it felt in the ordinary morning light when nothing was dramatized and nothing was helping and the world was simply itself. It held. She turned from the window and sat down at her desk. She opened the class register and read through the names. Third years, 24 of them. She went through the list with the particular quality of attention she had developed over 2 decades, not just reading names, but briefly, accurately, placing each one. Douglas Hathaway. Wand control improving, thinking still approximate. Needed to be challenged rather than guided. Eleanor Voss. Exceptional, needed harder material than the curriculum provided, ought to be pointed toward additional texts before Christmas. Thomas Aldrich. More curious than his marks reflected, the kind of student who came alive in conversation and needed to be watched for that. Moira Thatch. Steady and reliable, precise work, not naturally adventurous in her approach, but trustworthy to a standard that McGonagall found genuinely valuable and tried never to underestimate. She went through all 24. This was not something she did every morning. It was not a ritual she had designed or decided upon. She did it this morning because the names were in front of her, and she found, sitting here in the early light with the fresh parchment on the desk and the pen not yet uncapped, that she wanted to do it. That it was not a burden but something closer to the opposite. A settling of attention, a returning of focus to its correct object. These were her students. This was her list. She knew them incompletely but genuinely, in the way that you know people you are responsible for and take seriously, not as types or categories, but as individuals in specific moments of development, each of them somewhere on a long road that she could only see a small section of, trying to give them what they needed for the part of the road she could see, and trusting, imperfectly and without guarantees, that it would serve them on the parts she could not. She closed the register. She heard him before she saw him. The footsteps were distinctive, not heavy, not hurried, but carrying a particular quality of deliberateness that she had learned to recognize over 22 years, in the way you learn to recognize the footsteps of people you know well, which is to say, without thinking about it, simply as a fact your body registers before your mind catches up. Albus Dumbledore walked as though he had somewhere to be and had decided what pace he would take to get there, and was not to be rushed or detained by the ordinary pressures of institutional life. He passed her open doorway. He did not stop. He did not look in. Or if he looked in, it was briefly enough to constitute not looking in. But he slowed for exactly one step, with the precision of someone doing something intentional in the guise of something incidental. And then his footsteps continued, steady and unhurried, down the corridor and away. McGonagall looked at the empty doorway for a moment. She thought about what he had said yesterday, the last thing as she was leaving. She came on 3 Tuesday evenings, without being asked. She had carried those words through the rest of the day, not knowing entirely what to do with them, and she thought she understood them better this morning than she had last night. He had not been trying to comfort her. He had not been trying to remind her of her own effectiveness, as though that were the question. He had been pointing at something more specific, that what this place gave its students was not armor, and not certainty, and not survival, but something in the character, something in the quality of how they approach difficulty, the willingness to come back on a Tuesday evening without being asked, because the thing was not yet mastered, and they were the kind of person who did not leave things unmastered. That was what was teachable, not safety, not outcomes, the quality of how you met what came at you. She had known this. She had always known this. But knowing a thing and having it restored to you after a day of doubt were not the same experience, and she did not pretend they were. She uncapped her pen. The morning essays were in a stack on the left side of the desk. The third year's work on mental clarity and spell precision, which she had collected at the end of yesterday's lesson and had not yet read. She pulled the stack toward her and began. The first was adequate. The second was thin but showed a genuine attempt at the central argument. The third, she checked the name, was Eleanor Voss. 4 pages, precise small handwriting, with 2 footnotes this time instead of 1. The second footnote questioned whether mental clarity was a sufficiently rigorous term and proposed a distinction between clarity of image, clarity of intention, and clarity of will, suggesting these were 3 separate things that the literature treated as one. McGonagall read the footnote twice. She wrote, "This distinction is not only valid but important. You have identified a problem that practicing transfigurers encounter and rarely articulate this precisely. 15 points to Gryffindor. Come and see me before the end of term. I have a text that will interest you." She set it aside and took the next one. Douglas Hathaway had written 1.5 pages, which was more than she had expected, and the argument, while not rigorous, showed a genuine attempt to think about what mental clarity actually meant in practice, illustrated with an account of his own experience trying to switch the beetle yesterday. He had written, "I think the problem is that I keep checking whether I'm doing it right, and then I'm not doing it anymore. I'm just watching myself do it." McGonagall read this sentence twice as well. She wrote, "This is an accurate and honest account of a real phenomenon. The solution is practice sufficient to make the action automatic, at which point the watching becomes unnecessary because the doing no longer requires supervision. You are closer than you think." 7 points to Gryffindor. She paused after writing it. You are closer than you think. She did not write things she did not mean. She considered whether she meant it and found that she did. Douglas Hathaway, with his determined optimism and his approximate thinking and his 1.5 pages of genuine effort, was in fact closer than he thought. That was simply true. She moved to the next essay. The first students arrived at 20 minutes to 9, early, which was not unheard of for third years, who had a class first period and lived in dormitories close enough to the Transfiguration corridor to make earliness convenient rather than virtuous. She heard them before they reached the door, voices in the corridor, not loud but present, the particular social frequency of students between the ages of 13 and 14 who were never entirely not talking. She was at the board when they came in. She was writing the morning's lesson, the continuation of the switching work, moving today from surface properties towards structural ones, a step up in complexity that she had planned for this point in term, and that the class, on balance, was ready for. The chalk was steady in her hand. The letters were clean and precise, the way she had always written on boards, the way she intended to continue writing on boards. She heard them take their seats behind her. The particular sounds of it, bags set down, chairs adjusted, the rustle of someone getting out their textbook before being asked, which was either Eleanor Voss or Thomas Aldridge, and she would know which when she turned around. She finished writing. She set the chalk in the tray. She turned. 24 students, in various states of morning alertness, looking at her with a mixture of readiness and residual sleepiness that was entirely normal and entirely theirs. Douglas Hathaway in the middle row, sitting up straighter than usual, which she suspected had something to do with the 7 points. Eleanor Voss in the third row, with her textbook already open to the correct chapter, which meant she had read ahead again, which meant she already knew approximately what this lesson would cover and had come prepared to go further than it went. Thomas Aldridge near the window, looking at the board with the focused expression of someone already thinking about the problem, rather than waiting to be told what to think about it. 24 students. She clasped her hands behind her back. Yesterday, she said, you worked on surface properties. Texture, primarily. Some of you succeeded. Some of you are going to succeed today because you are going to try again, and you are going to apply what you learned yesterday about the relationship between mental clarity and spell precision. She looked briefly at Douglas Hathaway, who received the look with something approaching confidence. Today we move to structural properties. This is harder. The mental image required is more complex. Some of you will not fully succeed today, and that is not failure. That is the appropriate position to be in when you are learning something genuinely difficult. She paused. What I require from all of you is not success. What I require is that you bring your full attention to the attempt. She looked across the room, briefly, specifically, each face for a fraction of a second. That is always what I require. It has not changed. She turned to the cabinet and removed the box of beetles. Take one each. The incantation is on the board. They moved with the organized energy of students who knew the routine and had come prepared to work. She watched them collect the beetles, one each, returning to their seats, setting the small wooden objects on the desk in front of them with varying degrees of care. Eleanor Voss placed hers precisely in the center of the desk. Douglas Hathaway set his slightly to one side, looked at it, then moved it to the center as well. McGonagall looked at her class. The hollow feeling from yesterday was not entirely gone. She did not expect it to be gone. But it had changed in quality. It was no longer an absence so much as a space, and spaces, she had learned, were not the same as absences. A space was something you could work in. A space was something that could, over time, be filled by the work itself, by the ordinary accumulation of days and lessons and students and the small, unguaranteed, absolutely necessary business of teaching people to think. Begin, she said. The room filled with the quiet, concentrated sound of 24 people attempting something difficult. She moved to the first row and began. The letter came on a Tuesday. It was from the ministry, official this time, violet seal, cramped handwriting. And it said what the whole wizarding world was already saying in the corridors and the staff room and the streets outside, that Voldemort was gone, that it was over, that a 1-year-old boy in Godric's Hollow had done what no one else had managed, and that the long dark had, without warning or ceremony, ended. McGonagall read it at her desk. Then she opened the top left drawer, the one that held Hestia Pruett's 4-sentence letter, and the letters before it, and the ones before those, and she sat for a long time without moving. She thought about Katrina Fawley, who had not lived to see this morning. She thought about all of them who had not. She did not cry. That would come later, privately, and it would not be the last time. Grief, she had learned, did not conclude. It simply changed shape. After a while, she opened the class register. The names were the same as yesterday. 24 third years. Waiting for Thursday. Eleanor Voss with her footnotes. Douglas Hathaway, closer than he thought. Thomas Aldridge, following questions to wherever they led. Outside, someone in the corridor was crying. Not from grief, from the other thing, the sudden release thing that had no clean name, but that the castle was full of this morning. McGonagall closed the register. She uncapped her pen. There were essays to mark,